and welcome to Unapologetic Women, a podcast about current affairs, culture, politics, life, and how we got here, brought to you by Toni and Sorcha. These are unscripted conversations about the things that we care about, not the things that we're experts in. Oh, and there's probably going to be some swearing.
Toni, how are you doing?
God, that feels like a loaded question these days. I'm doing okay. I think you saw the news about Trump and immigration, not that we're going to spend too much time on that, but I think that just got me very, very angry.
Yeah, kicked me in the gut. For those of you listening, I am personally in the process of a green card, and I've had many different battles with visas and the likes of immigration in my journey in the US, and just seeing a nonchalant tweet at 10:30 p.m. Eastern from the President of the United States without any clarifying information. Honestly, it just upset me. It really upset me.
It's funny that you say that. It's the same. I had that same of like, this is so childish, of just like, there's consequences to what you say. We're always taught that as kids. There are, whatever you do, your actions, your words have consequences. And it was one of those where I'm just like, I am not going to sleep now. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are just going to be sat there glued to their Twitter account, glued to the news outlets. And it was fascinating reading the headlines the next day of, well, it's not a total ban, it's a partial ban. But also it was funny because it was worded in a way of, it falls short from what he had promised. And I was like, well, thank fuck. But also, yeah, it falls completely short of what he had so-called promised.
And that's because he doesn't have the legal authority to do it.
Moving swiftly on from that angle. I don't know. That's been top of mind for me. And how was your weekend? How was the last week for you, Sorcha?
Yeah, last week was good. Work was manic, and I got to attend a bunch of different webinars put on by partners. We hosted a bunch ourselves. One that stands out was the New York Times call that went into data privacy, which, as all of you know, that's the thing that Toni and I love. But it was interesting because all the content recently has been video and webinar and panel. And this was a phone call. Like, it was a phone conference as an event, which was just a very interesting way to disseminate information in COVID-19.
So very practically, you're just dialing into a phone call, like a conference call, basically.
No, you went in through a link, but it was all audio. Like, it was very much so audio present. But yeah, so then what else happened this week? I kind of hated myself a lot on Friday through Sunday. Definitely, it was one of those ones where I was just like, I hate not being outside. I haven't left my home. I was just very sad and like not fun to be around. And it took me a minute to acknowledge that. So I just like had some alone time for a while, and then kicked myself and said, I'm gonna, go for a run or do something to to get out of this funk. And so I've been on that journey, which has been nice post the like self-loathing that happened. Yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm at. What about you, my love?
And you're paying the price of running, aren't you?
Yes, I am. And I did that deep voice for those of you who have ever, taken a 6-week hiatus from working out or doing any type of activity, which is what I have done since my gym has closed. Doing an aggressive, like 45-minute run is not the best ease back in. I will and if you want to be able to walk the following days, definitely not the way to do it. So pro tip, don't do that.
Don't do that. At least you've got nowhere far to walk to since you're, we're all cooped up inside. So at least it's just up and down and left.
I have stairs. I have stairs.
Yes, you have stairs. Use your hands. It's funny you said that, because I feel like I've spent, similar to you, like all my week on just either Zoom calls or binge watching Too Hot to Handle, which I won't go in here, but it's amazing and it's so bad in so many ways. We can talk about it another time, but it's a Netflix. I binge watched it in a day. It's just wild. Netflix documentary about, it's a bit like Temptation. I've never watched any of these reality TV shows, but apparently it's a mix of Big Brother, Temptation Island, all of that. But they think all these single people are going to go and have fun.
I don't think Temptation Island is a thing. Are you talking about Love Island?
Oh, that's the one.
Okay, I was like, I feel like this is not my juju. I do not watch it. I was actually on a call where someone found out that I didn't know what Survivor was. Fun fact.
Didn't know what that is either until recently.
Yeah, and now I just realised that you were definitely talking about Love Island. So I was like, Temptation Island, I haven't heard of that one.
Oh, Love Island.
Correction.
But
correction.
There's no host. There's only an AI and just a voice that basically takes the piss out of these four people who think they're coming on an island to basically have fun and have sex. And they're told that there's a giant pot of money to win, but you can only win it if you don't touch each other, don't kiss, and don't have sex, which I thought was hilarious, but also very timely in a COVID-19 pandemic where there's people who are just like being told they can't do things. Anyway, so I binge watched that and I've been doing Zoom calls. So that I've had a very productive week. But I'll tell you one thing that was interesting. I joined the webinar with Anna Palmer from Politico and Busy Phillips. And Busy Phillips, although she said a lot of things, one of the things that stood out to me, which I thought was fascinating, as I've been toying with this idea for the past week, was we've all got mum brain syndrome right now. Like this idea that when you're a new mum, there's so much that happens that you can't concentrate, you can't think straight, you can't think for anything. It's just everything is changing. There's no new normal. And so she was basically saying that this is what's happening to all of us right now during the pandemic, is we've all got mum brain syndrome, which I was like, that makes actually a lot of sense.
Mum brain as in like mothering mum.
As in new mum. As you've just given birth, you just have a new kid, your new normal has been flipped upside down. You can't think straight. You can't retain any information. You're barely sleeping. Your brain is just functioning at a very different rate. Your brain is also, obviously I'm not a mother, so excuse me if this is all totally wrong, but your brain is always somewhere else, not where it's supposed to be, and supposed to be is in inverted commas. And she was like, this is what it feels like. It feels like we've all got new mum brain right now, where we just don't know what we should be thinking. We're not sleeping. No one's very relaxed. Everyone's stressed out for one thing or the other. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. The whole world has got a new mum brain, which I kind of love, because I've seen a lot of tweets right now of saying things like, no man or woman ever is going to wonder what mothers do all day at home.
Yeah.
Ever again. A guy tweeted saying, are you two also working on the weekend? Because I'm not getting my work done during the week. And like, you can imagine the uproar of mothers going, welcome to our life and what we've been dealing with for the last 20 years. Oh, brilliant.
Women and COVID-19. It's a serious impact. We touched on it before, but it's just, can't say enough about it. It's going to be such a different experience for women and how they're impacted by it than it will be for men.
Yeah. And then we had one event that you, I think, told me to go to.
Yes.
Which was Fighting Misinformation While Promoting Free Speech, which was hosted by, I think, The Bridge and All Tech is Human. And they just brought in two leading experts from Penn University and a disinformation expert, which is perfect because I got to listen to that. And we wanted to talk about misinformation this week.
Misinformation. Yeah, that I was gutted to have missed that, but I did actually get a chance to listen back to it, and I found them to be fantastic speakers. And you got a question in there, Toni.
Oh, I did. Can't remember what the exact wording was, but so here's the thing. It was a panel full of Americans, and similar to you, and just like, well, actually maybe more so me, but I'm incapable of having a conversation about a global problem like misinformation or a pandemic for that matter, and not looking at it through the lens of what does a global solution look like. Again, like going back to what we were talking about last week of it's impossible to solve these problems. They know no borders. They know no boundaries. They don't stop at states, how are we going to solve this at a global level? Because it's no use solving it at a local level. And I think the question I asked was more or less that, what does it look like to find global solutions to the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation? What is that going to require from all of us to find that solution? And I obviously didn't actually get an answer to that. Mostly, I think, because all the panelists were Americans. So I think it's really hard to get out of that lens of not looking at it only from an American lens. But also it was interesting because the whole event was misinformation and disinformation whilst promoting free speech, which is a very American thing. We don't have this concept of free speech in Europe, and you don't have it in many other countries outside of America, which is fascinating.
To the global point, Toni, I remember the woman's name who's escaped me. She worked for Microsoft formerly in that panel, and she had talked about, it was something that stood out to me in that conversation, she touched on a project that Microsoft was funding in a country in Africa for a government. And it was many, many years ago now. And the first instance of seeing this concept of spread of misinformation. And the little like tidbit that I took away from that was when she turned around and said, we all knew at that time, none of this would be taken seriously until it impacted a Western democracy. Oof. And fast forward to 2016, or in this moment in time, rewind to 2016, and we see it impact a Western democracy at a level, it's such a large scale that we had to talk about the conversation around fake news and misinformation, disinformation. That nugget really struck out to me. I think, Toni, it'd be really helpful before we really dive into this conversation to get a definition, because I know you and I have had a conversation around the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So I'll kick it to you to give us a little overview.
Pressure. It's so interesting when it's one of so for me, I thought it was very clear to everyone what the difference between misinformation and disinformation was. And again, I think I'm going through this from a European lens, where you can't try and solve a problem if you don't define what the problem is. And you have to be very, very clear on what defining what misinformation versus disinformation is. And then talking with you, which we'll talk about it a bit further, it was fascinating that that's actually not a given and that's different for everyone. And we don't actually have a global definition of what these things are. Similar to hate speech, actually, in America, we're still trying to solve, obviously, hate speech, and we still haven't defined what hate speech actually is. So in my mind, misinformation is something when it refers to maybe inaccuracies, but the idea is that any inaccuracy stems from error, so it's not purposeful. Whereas disinformation for me is deliberate. It's deliberate falsehood, and it's promulgated by design, like it's purposeful in the idea of wanting to deliberately claim something that is false and spread it. And we all know that we all know it's pretty obvious that the most effective misinformation starts with a seed of truth. I mean, that I learned that when I was very young. If you're going to lie something that's actually not too far-fetched, that's actually very close to truth if you want to get away with it. I don't know in what contents I was taught how to lie, but I know that was a thing that happened when I was a kid. And so what I found interesting is there's a huge, I think it was back in 2018, the European Commission held a high-level group and they published a big report on misinformation. And they brought in lots of experts to sort of understand and define this. And they had a very clear definition of what that was. And disinformation as defined by the European Commission includes like all forms of false, inaccurate, misleading information designed and presented and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or to profit from that disinformation. So for me, that's the biggest difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation, we probably all do it in one way, shape or form. Actually, Sorcha, you're big in big group chats and family chats. I know you have a lot of that. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but I'm in one and I've actually stayed silent. And I realize why. It's because there's so many people in the group that keep on sharing posts from Facebook or Twitter, and it's false. And I just sit there and I have a really hard time seeing false information being shared between family members that you trust. And who are we, if the grandmother or the kid is trusting this, are we supposed to say, hey, wait, can I just get a back check? Where did you get this from? Or am I just going to easily, trust you? But then that information gets spread with another group that you have because you thought the joke was quite funny or the tweet was hilarious, and you share it with a group of friends. And then that's how so for me, that's misinformation. I'm not trying to do it with public harm, but we still have, I think, a responsibility of checking the information that we're spreading because it spreads so far and wide today. So I'm just curious if you've ever had that experience of being in group chats or family chats where you're just like, I'm not quite sure that's true.
Yeah. I think the other thing to put this into context is we're in a pandemic, right? So we see massive increase in screen time. And so that leads to a lot more people interacting with content that they may not normally engage with. So I think just to preface a conversation,
that's so true.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. But the piece, Toni, we were talking about of, I think, sharing within your community. Yeah. As opposed to, which can lead to misinformation, as opposed to sharing with malicious intent. Yeah. Which is what you're talking about as it relates to disinformation. And the disagreement you and I came to or have touched on is to say that someone is doing it with malintention means that there has to be a fact or a determination of what the fact was. That's clear for me in like a healthcare example.
Yeah.
So the example that Charlie gave in that the Charlie Warzel in the New York Times call was around the difference between political misinformation, which we're all pretty used to in the last 4 years in the US, versus a healthcare like misinformation. And so I'm going to paraphrase kind of what he said, but just kind of the lens I have on that. So like we're most familiar with the political kind of misinformation. And we've seen that over the past 6 years. So an example, right, was the Hillary Clinton news story of running a child sex slave system.
Yeah.
When I say news story, I say that with, inverted commas, but it was pushed out in particularly conservative publications. It was pushed out across social media platforms. And his whole point here was like, while this is damaging and it is dangerous as it relates to misinformation, it's not dangerous to public health misinformation. So if we flip this into like a COVID-19 moment and two people receive the information that you can go outside and if you point to the sky, you're cured of COVID-19.
Yeah.
They then share that with their friends and family, like you're talking about in a WhatsApp group or whatever it is. That is much more dangerous and significantly impactful to public health than this political concept of misinformation. But it doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other. Yeah.
And I agree with that. I actually, there's another piece in the New York Times. It sounds like we read the same pieces around like, okay, why is it so easier to solve when lives are at stake? But I want to add that like if immediate lives are at stake, because when you're doing disinformation and you're getting I'm going to say wrong people, right or wrong, that's a whole other debate, but you're getting the wrong people elected to run a country, they're still going to impact your actual lives day to day on the same way. But the impact is more like long term. So I just think as human beings, it's so much easier for us to understand, you could die from this tomorrow or from 2 weeks from now. So it's really important that the information gets right rather than this information is going to lead to the wrong types of people being elected. And again, wrong is really hard, but I have a lack of other words right now to use that are actually going to impact your lives and could potentially cause you harm down the line. But you're looking at 10, 20, 30 years maybe down the line or even 5.
Well, I think this is where we disagree, right? And in that conversation, because and I know the word wrong is not the word you want to use there, Toni, but whose decision is that? Like what entity exists to identify and say, this is fact and this is not. Yeah. And whether that is about a policy or about a particular politician, the concept of someone saying this is the fact when it's outside of medical or math is extremely gray. And it goes to this freedom of speech component that's very prevalent in the US, but not as such in the EU.
It's basically who has the right for their voices to be heard and listened to and trusted. And it's interesting because on the call that I was on with All Tech is Human, David, who is the founder, actually brought up a perfect example that's been spinning through my head as well. But he says, look, perfect example is Gwyneth Paltrow with her Goop empire we are very used to her saying things that are just wildly inaccurate, not, factually with no healthcare basis. What was it? The thing that her yoni egg or whatever it was to shove inside of women that's going to cure you of all things that made no sense whatsoever. Jade, have you never heard the story, the Jade egg?
No, because I have such an unfounded hatred of the whole concept of Goop. So we can
same here. Same here. And she launched a whole Netflix thing, but it's fascinating to me that something like that is put on Netflix. And again, I think it's very American, and I don't think this would ever happen in Europe. And and she's sharing these things that she believes women should do for their health, which are founded on grounded on zero facts, zero healthcare medical experts whatsoever. But one of the things that she did say 2 weeks before, so a couple of weeks ago, we had the WHO still saying that average human beings on the street should not be using masks. They specifically said, leave that to the medical experts. You're fine. You don't need it. Gwyneth Paltrow went on Goop and whatever medium it was and was saying, no, all individuals, you should all be wearing masks. Where she got that knowledge from, why she thought that was accurate, I do not know. But she was saying that, and she was basically directly contradicting the World Health Organization. And it so happens that 2 weeks later, the World Health Organization came back and said, no, actually, you should all be wearing masks. And so there was a moment there for Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow going, well, told you so. And so it's just a fascinating. It so happens that this time she was right. But who is she and why? It's like basically trusting influencers and their platforms and their voices when really maybe we shouldn't be. And so there's something there for me of and again, this might be a very European lens of looking at things. I need an institution that I can trust. I need an institution that is going to be the sole source or one of the sole sources of what is going to be deemed accurate. And I think everyone else needs to shut up. And I know that goes against freedom of speech, but
it does. And I think it goes against to sound idealistic here, it goes against the concept of the American dream. Right? Like going back to the 30s and like anyone can be a leader. And it goes against a lot of things that I believe to be true in the world around. And I think the question for me is, where does the responsibility lie of whoever is projecting it? If you have a platform of 50,000 people or 500,000 people that are receiving and digesting your content, you as the person producing that content has the responsibility to ensure that you have fact checked that.
Yeah.
But where do you fact check that against? Again, I'm going to lean on the like science thing. If it's science, then fine. There is a clear black and white and right and wrong. And someone will probably argue that there's more shades there.
Yeah.
But if it is belief, if it is religion, if it is political ideology, that is up for interpretation.
Yeah.
Just like point blank.
I think it is until it leads to public harm. And it's funny because I have the same vision of you of this idea of leading and this idea of leadership, and everyone should have the opportunity and the chance to step up and lead and have their voice being heard. We need to shift the world that we're in today, where it's a middle-aged white dude who has X number of years behind him who should be the voice of reason. Like I desperately want to change that. But I think, and I also agree that there's a lot, and I've had this argument a lot, there's a lot of responsibility on the end user and the citizen. Like I always say this to people who are like, well, I just read this and it was on Reddit, it was on Twitter, so it had to be true. And I was like, I'm sorry, stop being stupid. You've got a responsibility as an informed citizen to fact check where you're getting things, to check. But also we're putting a lot of responsibility and a lot of burden on these people, influencers, to do that fact checking, which realistically is not happening today. And we're seeing it even with journalists, that kind of level of fact checking isn't happening today because of the business model in which we are in, which is get information out fast. We want to be the first with that news information. The news cycle is moving faster than ever before, that things are falling through the cracks. So even if the experts like journalists who are supposed to be the beacons of, truth and bringing us that are failing at that, how can we expect influencers and average citizens to get anywhere close to that? Even though in my ideal world, in my utopia, yes, we are all, every time we speak, we're actually thinking about what we're saying.
Yeah. And like, I don't know if we'll ever get to that, but what you're saying to me there, Toni, brings up a piece of like marginalized communities that don't have access to education, that don't have access, like their one stream of news content is the Facebook. Enter-in ideological, like a Republican news outlet, for example, or a Democratic news outlet, whatever you want to interact with, that sends you a full-on magazine once a week of the information that you should know about. That those people are not being, like, they're a prime target for people who do want to be bad actors and actually engage with disinformation. And there's a whole host of conversations we can go down here. And the thread I want to pull out, Toni, is the responsibility piece, and flip us into a space around the technology's responsibility. Because I know in both the events we talked about with the New York Times and All Tech is Human, this came up a lot around the responsibility of technologies and their platforms to be vehicles at which these news stories, these disinformation, fake news comes out of, and the speed at which things can spread and go viral, this concept of going viral. But what is the technology company's responsibility when it comes to freedom of speech?
Yeah.
Like, what does that look like?
I've always argued that there's a big responsibility to be had in the hands of the tech companies. And I think it's interesting because, we've clearly read a lot from the New York Times this week, because the New York Times, I know, came out with a new podcast called The Rabbit Hole, which I find fascinating. And it's from one of their tech journalists, Kevin Rose. And he basically goes down the rabbit hole of trying to discover what happens when our lives are increasingly online, which is absolutely the case these days. And he asked the question of basically what is the internet doing to us, to all of us? And they've only had one episode come out, but he talks about this specifically, and he talks in a different world, but he gives the example of a college dropout in West Virginia, and this college dropout found himself with nothing other to do than to watch videos on YouTube, and he ends up down the rabbit hole of continuously binge watching binge watching, videos on YouTube, they get more racist, more misogynistic, more conspiracy theory oriented. And those two problems, he talks about there's two problems with that. One, it's the fact that once you start watching a video that might be a little bit misogynistic, we're going to give you another one that's even more. And that's the algorithm on YouTube. The second one is the automatic play, that you haven't even finished a video, that there's another one lined up for you, which means that you're like constantly in this ever ending loop of being fed that information. And so he calls out, and I agree with this, that although this might sound like an end user, and we joke about this on Netflix when Netflix is, are you still watching? And you're like, yeah, I've got nowhere else to be in COVID-19, but here, yes, I'm still watching. But what that means is we turn into passive users of, I don't even have to press next. I don't even have to have that moment of thinking about, do I actually want to watch another video, whether that's Netflix or YouTube? Is this actual information, or is this news stream, or this type of content useful or interesting to me? Or should I go and see what else is out there? Bursting that bubble that YouTube has all of a sudden just gone and created for you. And we see on Facebook as well of these algorithms, I'm going to feed you the exact content that we believe you need. And I think that's dangerous. And as much as on the surface level, it can feel very useful and maybe time consuming, or even valuable to some people, I think we need to wake up a little bit, like quite literally wake up a little bit and realize that we are just very dormant and very passive right now, just taking in the information that's being fed to us. So I think a platform like YouTube, and I agree with Kevin on this, absolutely needs to maybe rethink the way that they're force feeding that information. But we also had Facebook. Sorry, go for it.
No, go.
We also had Facebook over the weekend that for one of and this was something I wanted to dig into you, but because you know Facebook way better than me since I refuse to be on Facebook. But has for the first time decided to take out what they deemed as dangerous and harmful content, such as all of the events that were happening over the weekend to rally, even though everyone was told inside, stay inside, don't go in big groups. Because they deemed, and so there was a bunch of Facebook groups, and Facebook events that happened of come and, what's the word I'm looking for? Not rally,
protest.
Thank you, Sorcha. Come and protest for our, country to be reopened, our economy to be reopened, which was very dangerous in a time where we're being told to, social distance and stay at home. And so they've actually taken the decision, which I think is going to lead them down a slippery slope, but a very interesting one of, they took down this content that they deemed harmful to the general public because it could lead to health issues, which they've never done in, with public, what you were talking about with public, political disinformation, which I find fascinating.
The YouTube piece is interesting because I think YouTube has a responsibility to potentially diversify the content. So if I pick a video on apples, are you then going to show me another whole stream of apple content as opposed to orange content? It's a very ridiculous example, but you know what I mean. On the Facebook piece, so I think it was just before the midterms, they rolled out the political ad libraries. And so for folks listening, you can go in, anyone who is a political candidate, registered political candidate, you can go into their ad history. In that, you can see the demographics that this ad is targeted at, the amount of money spent on this particular ad set. You can see the author and who the payment is behind. And why that's really important when you think about disinformation, especially in the United States, is this concept of PACs, right? And so these political action committees that can fund and funnel money into a campaign. And before Facebook made this change around transparency, in particular into ads, because the other thing to note here is people not actually knowing the difference. And as someone who's actually put ads out into the world, I loved when people didn't know the difference from my ad content versus my organic content for candidates. Yeah. It's very interesting because people respond very differently when they are cognizant that it was an ad surfaced to them versus an organic content or something that was shared. And we know this, right? Yeah. If something is shared by friends and family, it's got a 95% higher engagement rate, all that jazz. Yeah. And so this moment in 2017, 2018 by Facebook was a really big stake in the ground. We're going to actually start to be honest and truthful with it. However, it didn't stop the content. Yeah. So that this question and concept of if it's health, we have a very clear line to draw where if you are impacting someone's health, we can say, great, this content gets removed. Yeah. If it's political, which to your point, Toni, right, there is an impact. It's just might be 10 years down the line. Yeah. but it's a harder line to draw of who's right and who's wrong. Right. So if we look at, and, you know, when this is spoken about, at least in my own absorption of media, it comes from a very much so like anti-right wing. But if I look at this in the green pack, right, the new law that AOC is trying to push out into the world, there were ads done on that people on the right believed to be untrue and inaccurate as it related to facts around climate change. And there was a push, right, for those ads to be taken down because they were seen as misinformation as it related to what was going to happen with the funding of that law going through.
Fascinating.
We normally hear this on the side of, right, like the right wingers are pushing out that women shouldn't be allowed to have abortions and all of these lies and misinformation around the health of the woman and the child, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a good example, right, of you and I who tend to lean in a more left ideology, where who owns the responsibility to decide which of those ads should or should not be removed because of the potential of misinformation. I don't think it's Facebook.
I don't think so either. No, I agree. But I go back to someone, an institution somewhere, I don't care who it is, has to be able to come together and agree on what is factually accurate and what isn't. Similar to I think it is now, you might actually disagree with this, but I think it is now historically and factually agreed upon that the world is not flat, it is round. So if someone is going to try and convince a bunch of school kids that the earth is flat, that needs to be removed. But it took years for us to get there. And it took physical and the right type of experts in that field to go, no, we've got but there's still people who are saying, no, you have to prove it to me. I still don't believe you. And so that thing takes years, but we need to trust basically. And I think this is why I love institutions like the European Commission, specifically the European Commission, that is like that beacon of this is it. We've gathered all the experts. We've come to the conclusion that this is factually accurate or not. We need that, or else we're leaving it. It ends up being the Wild West, or we leave it worse. We play this idea of, we give it in the hands of the tech companies who already wield so much power. We're giving them even more power to decide what voices should be heard and what shouldn't. And they also, as David from All Tech is Human said, they don't want this power and they don't want that responsibility. Most tech companies do not want it.
No, but the public is yearning for it.
That's it.
The public and the general populace in all countries that you and I have worked in or lived in are yearning for it, because there's a new focus and a new lens on how people are pushing content towards you and what it is that you're receiving and why you're receiving it. And this understanding of micro-targeting. Why am I included in this ad set? Why am I being delivered this message? Exactly, right? Like, what do they know about me and why do they know it?
Sorcha, when you say the public is yearning for this, are you, in your mind, do you think that the public is specifically yearning for those platforms to, and then quote unquote, step up, take responsibility? Or are they just yearning for something to tell them what is right, acceptable, wrong, what is happening, what's not? Or does it have to come from the tech companies, or can it be some other institution, whether that be the government, whatever that is?
It's a scary shit statement to state.
Yeah.
My honest belief in that, Toni, is that we've moved into a place where companies like Facebook and companies like Twitter have more respect and more trust than our government institutions. And one data point to that, the number of people that vote versus the number of daily users on Facebook's platform. I bet you if I walked down my street and I knocked on everyone's door, won't do it, social distancing, but they wouldn't be able to tell me who our congressional rep was. But they would be able to tell me who Mark Zuckerberg was.
And that's interesting, because it's basically people are not disengaged with politics, but they're disengaged with the politicians and the current institutions that we have.
It's I don't know, what are they going to do about it? I know that Facebook did this cool thing with ads, so now I can see how much money they have. I know that when everything came out about the bleach thing, where that couple in Nebraska died because they swallowed the medicine. I know that Facebook put the banner up saying that this is not accurate health information, check with the CDC and check with WHO. Facebook has and Twitter have come back to good graces, we'll say, from, rewind this 6 months.
Yeah.
And the other thing to note here is Facebook is actually still under investigation in the United States.
Oh, that's a good point. Remind us what it's under investigation for, like very briefly.
There's a bunch of different investigations, so I'm not going to speak to that specifically. I can put it in the episode.
Please, it'll be useful, just as a reminder. And it's so funny because it feels like 2 years or 4 years or 10 years have passed since that, because, again, COVID-19, the world is wild right now, that every day feels like 10 years. But going back to the point that you were making about Facebook. So Facebook removing content that they basically came out with a statement saying that they're removing the content that promotes anti-quarantine protests, that's using false information, saying things such as social distancing doesn't actually stop the virus spread, which we all know to be false. Now, Facebook apparently coordinated this with the WHO to get that information. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, we are in when it comes to health, it sounds like the WHO is the one that we should be listening to. And again, not Gwyneth Paltrow, WHO. So my guess is there needs to be a body of work for us to respect institutions like the WHO with the last word when it comes to what things are accurate, false in this case here. And it's great that Facebook or companies like Facebook are working with them to decide what they are then, because it's not Facebook alone that decided this is false, this is true. They worked with the WHO to make that happen. So I guess this is where I'm going back to, like, who decides that? I need more institutions like that. And I would love an institution when it comes to politics or other realms that aren't as easy as healthcare, but an institution that these tech companies can work with.
And specifically, Toni, you're saying for freedom of speech?
Freedom of speech is a hard one. Like it's the same, but I would love an organization, and maybe this exists and I'm being really dumb, where misinformation and disinformation spreads a lot as well, is with this concept of hate speech, of like, what do platforms take down hate speech? Well, before we decide on if platforms have the duty and the responsibility to take down hate speech that is impacting people's lives because they're calling for lynching or the murder of certain very marginalized communities, we need to define what hate speech is. And we still haven't been able to define what hate speech is and isn't in America. And I am yearning for an organization, an institution somewhere to come up with very clear guidelines of what we deem hate speech and what we deem acceptable and not acceptable in society today as a whole, so that then Facebook and the other platforms can do the same thing as what they just did with the WHO. Because right now it's not possible. And I don't want tech platforms to decide what they deem as hate speech and what they don't, because we know that doesn't work. Censorship doesn't work. No. We've got to stop calling for, tech CEOs to censor, to your point, certain political parties rather than other. We've got to have a wider discussion about this, because you end up censoring the people that you want to protect.
Well, and that brings up AI for me, first off, around looking at user-generated content, because when you're Facebook and you have 400 billion daily users, there is no team in the world that can eyeball individually and say, this content is bad, this content is good, right? So like there is a robotics component to what we're talking about, a artificial intelligence component, which will exist and it will be a lot more advanced than this, but the baseline infrastructure of keywords, words that are used that could potentially promote hate, words that are used that are inaccurate against whatever guideline or infrastructure was set in place. And that is a massive shift. Like, technology in the last 5 years has completely changed. And we talk about it most commonly in the lens of social media. Yeah. We are seeing AI. Think about your smart fridge. Think about your Amazon Alexa, where you can say, order tissue, right? Whatever it is. And that happens. And all of a sudden you have tissue on your doorstep. Yeah. That's happened. And the actual legislators need to be brought into that, because, Toni, to your point here of the World Health Organization, that entity has existed for decades. Yep. Who knew about them before this? Who communicated with them? When was there a partnership decided to be derived between Facebook and the World Health Organization? Like, the United Nations exists as a entity that can set boundaries and guidelines for that. But if it is not put into the public eye, if it is not then acted upon by like Facebook or technology as a whole taking a stand and saying, okay, the United Nations has given a clear declaration of what hate speech is. We are now going to work on an AI and robotics technology to actually remove hate speech from our platform. That's a fake example, just like that hasn't happened. But that to me is like where this can go. And those institutions already exist, but they are just not popular. They are not populist. People aren't excited about them.
And I think beyond them not being popular and excited about, it is just by this conversation alone, it is such a complex issue that no one actually is bothered to actually try it. And I know this is not true, but the general sense is we're not bothered to actually try and solve the complexity of a problem like this at the scale at which we're trying to solve it, which is a global scale, full stop. Bring in India, bring in Africa, we've all got different versions of free speech, hate speech, all of that. But we need to come up with global standards, which if you look at it from just a European lens, the European Commission isn't even able right now to solve for the distribution of masks across all of Europe, isn't able to solve for who and what medication gets put out there in the world and how it lands in different countries, because they don't have the authority to do so. Because right now, as citizens, we're looking to our local government and our national government to solve them for us. And that's just like human nature to want to do that. So to your point, these large institutions don't have the credibility because as citizens, we don't give them that credibility. And as the media, we probably don't give them the amount of space or coverage that they require to be taken seriously and for people to know about them.
But and there's an education thing to that, right? Like, I'll go back to the United Nations. Like, they have thousands, if not tens of thousands of different programs running at every given moment. And I take myself to be a very well-informed individual, but I couldn't give you the breadth and depth of the work that they're doing.
Too.
And I know that they have a definition of hate speech. I know that they do. But has it been disseminated? Have people been taught about it? Has it been implemented into policy?
It's also been rejected
then the other thing
by Americans. It's not their definition of hate speech.
That's fascinating. It hasn't been rejected by elected officials, right?
I don't think so, but there's Nadine Strossen wrote a phenomenal book on hate speech and how to combat it, and you combat it with more dialogue rather than censorship. It's a brilliant book. We'll link it as well. It's like a meaty book, and she's a lawyer, but she talks about that there has been a lack of agreement globally and understanding of what hate speech is, regardless of all the number of definitions that are actually out there. But people won't agree that that's their definition, because you come back to, well, you might define it that way. I define it a certain way.
Yeah. And that goes to actual legal constructs. So like, it is law until it is disproved, right? So like, if there's precedent is set that law is no longer valid or is outdated, right? This has to be a constant and ever evolving conversation, because as technology advances and as humanity advances, things change, people shift. We have to be able to keep up with that. And in my opinion, the responsibility lies in elected officials, the people that we put in place to make those decisions. And they should rely on people at the United Nations, people at WHO, people at CDC. Like, there are so many of those institutions. I'll look at the National Association of Manufacturers even put out a massive piece last week around what the value of people going back to work in a safe social distancing concept would mean for the economy without actually impacting public health, right? Like, there are institutions doing these bodies of work, and as our elected officials have to lean into it and have to have more dialogue, to your point, Toni, so that we can continue to have new and evolving policies to like actually help aid humanity.
So interesting hearing you say that. I had a moment of what's actually missing here is a lack of understanding, to your point, lack of understanding in education, but also empathy about the different fields in which everyone is working. So, for example, the legislators are always trying to solve problems of today or yesterday. They're incapable of solving problems that are going to happen in 5 years, 6 years. So they're always running behind the curve. The reason for that is they have zero understanding, even the smartest of them, of what is possible today with the technology. The reason they don't have that understanding is because the tech CEOs and the technologists are unwilling to open up, because the moment they open up, we know what's going to happen is they get prodded and pushed of, well, you can't do that. That's legally not possible. That's not feasible. So they're not opening up and they're actually shutting down. And then I spoke to a female friend, I don't know why I said female, but a friend journalist who said it was so much easier for her when she was a journalist in the financial sector, because the moment you become a journalist in the tech sector, you're expected to be all knowledgeable about software and technology that wasn't available 6 months ago, 2 years ago, and you're constantly trying to understand and catch up on something that's ever evolving and moving faster, to your point, than ever before. So there's like a misunderstanding and a lack of empathy of how we work together to actually solve for these problems. Because it means like stepping into someone else's shoes or trying to keep up on something that you are not knowledgeable about.
It's a reactive versus proactive.
Right now, that's absolutely what it is.
Like, and how do we shift it?
I feel like you and I could talk for another 6 hours on this.
That's accurate.
We'll probably have another part on it. I love discussing this with you, Sorcha. It gets me thinking every time of what's missing and what we need to do. Just the body of work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorcha. Talk to you next week.
Bye.
For the super fans, also known as my mum and dad, thanks for staying with us right through the end and appreciate it. If you would like to, follow us along at www.unapologeticwomen.co, even though I already know you know that. We've got it bookmarked.